You know, a friend of mine who's a pastor in Philadelphia told me a story about a man who was recently ordained in their presbytery there. Now, ordaining a man to ministry is a really great joy for any presbytery. It's the thing we like to do the most. But this one in particular was remarkable because just 4 years earlier, the man had almost dropped out of the church and left Christianity completely. You see, he had dedicated his life to serving God. And at the time, he was working at a church and he was in seminary and he was preparing for ministry. Then he had his first child, a little girl, who was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy. Now, as far as this guy was concerned, that kind of suffering was not part of the bargain with God. The deal was that he had with God, or he thought he had with God, was that he would serve God and God would bless him. The man was focused on himself and what he'd get out of the deal. When God didn't bless him and actually brought suffering into his life, he was no longer willing to serve. And so he left the ministry for a while. It wasn't until, through other circumstances, he turned that bitterness over to God, trusting God again, even God's faithfulness, even in suffering, that he was restored to the joy of his salvation and got back into ministry. I want us to focus one more day on the complaining of the Hebrews and their bitterness. Thinking about that story in the background. You see, John Calvin made a very insightful comment on this part of the story where he said, God might have given them sweet water to drink at first, but he wished by the bitter to make prominent the bitterness which lurked in their hearts. You see, the Hebrews didn't just complain out of the blue. They complained out of a heart of bitterness, out of a heart that was very self-focused, out of a heart that already had forgotten what God had just done 3 days earlier. They complained out of a heart that wasn't thankful, but a heart that was bitter and felt entitled to the things that God would give to them or the things they thought they deserved. In fact, Psalm 106 points this out, where it says, Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works, and they did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love, but rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea. So it's a commentary on this part of the passage. The root of their bitterness, and therefore God having to show them their bitterness at Marah, was forgetful hearts that had just seen the redemption of God and yet doubted his abundant, steadfast love for them. They were so focused on themselves, like that pastor that I told you about, that they had forgotten to consider God's mighty works. They had forgotten to remember the abundance of his steadfast love right after they had seen it happen in the parting of the Red Sea. And as the psalmist said, that made them bitter, like the pastor the pastor friend of my friend. You see, youth, when we suffer something that is bitter in itself, however bitter that is, it does not need to make us bitter. You see, the problem at Marah was not really the water, bitter though it was. The bitterness of the hearts of the people was the problem. They were already so self-focused that when, of course, they drank the water, they just expressed that bitterness. You see, bitterness doesn't come out of outward circumstances, the suffering in our lives. That's not where it comes from. It comes out of our inward response in the condition of our hearts. It comes from hearts that are so self-focused. If our hearts were already self-focused, then of course we're going to be complaining and bitter when something bad happens to us, just like the Hebrews did in this passage, like being quarantined, for example, or life being thrown out of whack by a virus. Yet if our hearts are focused on God and his goodness and all he that's done for us, then even when he leads us to bitter waters for a particular reason, we will pray instead of complain, like we talked about yesterday. So how do we get focused like that? That's the question. Well, we need to create a habit of thankfulness in us. You see, our culture is a culture of complaining, and we're going to pick that up naturally. We don't have to try to pick that up. We're going to need to fight for good habits. One way to do that is through your daily devotions, focusing on Jesus. You see, when we look to Jesus, see our sin compared to his holiness, see our utter need of him, see his sacrificial love for us, eventually we can't help but stand in awe of Him, which takes our eyes up off of our own selves and puts them back on our salvation that we should have remembered, like the psalmist says about the Hebrews. Another way is to cultivate an attitude of thankfulness through daily habits. A garden doesn't just grow good food by itself. You have to cultivate it, you have to weed it, you have to water it, you have to feed it. Well, thankfulness isn't going to grow in you by itself. You have to cultivate it through habits. We all have to do that. One of the things that I do right off the bat is, and when I wake up every morning, I list the things that I'm thankful for from the previous day or the previous night, right after I wake up. It starts my day off on the right foot. I even write some of them down in a little journal that I have so I can look at them later and pray about them later. Another way to do it is to end the day in basically the same way, which is something we do with our boys each night before they go to bed. They have to pick one blessing from the day that they're thankful for, and we all thank God for that. Put a note on your mirror. Put a note on your closet door. Put it on the home screen of your cell phone, something like that, that asks you, what do I have to be thankful for? And then answer that at least every morning and every evening. Habits like that, or you can think of your own ways. Things like that will cultivate a heart of thankfulness instead of bitterness, so that even during difficult times when we come to bitter waters, so to speak, we will pray instead of complain, like we talked about yesterday. So you guys think about that, and I'll see you again tomorrow.